thesis with flying squids. And then I did my master's at Oxford University. So I spent a year and a half in the UK, and it was a very nice time. I did my master's with grassland birds. And then I spent like 20 years doing environmental education, but they couldn't really see a change in behavior. People could know more about different subjects, but that didn't mean that they will change their behavior. So I started thinking, what can I do? Because this is not working. So I decided to start a PhD in sustainability science at the National University in Mexico City on behavioral interventions and what do we need to know to design a behavior intervention. And I'm about to finish, probably will defend next month. So, you know, PhDs are a long process, and I'm really happy to be on the final line and about to defend my work. So I did this presentation with some of that knowledge that I have learned through these years. It's a general topic because Francesca told me that it's a very diverse group. So, and I just have 15 minutes, so there's not much time. So I am very interested in doing these behavioral change interventions, not just for meat consumption, but for other sustainability problems as well. I think that we need to have a step forward on not just letting people know that there's a problem, but also on how do we help society transition to this more sustainable lifestyles. So you tell me, Francesca, when we can start. I don't know how many people.
I think we can start. It's already 2:05. Let's have a start. I'm sure there might be a few more people joining us, but given that we're recording it, that's fine. They can always catch up afterwards. Over to you, Basi. Thank you so much.
Okay, you cannot see the Zoom instructions, right? You just see my PowerPoint screen, right? Okay, good. So my talk today, it's about behavioral change interventions, and it's what triggers can be used to change consumers' behavior to choose a more sustainable lifestyle, and especially to reduce meat consumption. So what do we understand by sustainable lifestyles? It's a lifestyle that minimizes resources use and the environmental impact. And this can be achieved through alternative transportation, through green homes, less consumption, zero waste, and sustainable food choices. And this is important because food production has a large environmental footprint. 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems. And as you can see here, food systems have an impact in different levels, from land use to crop production and livestock and fisheries, and all the chain that goes from the field to our table, and food processing, transport, packaging, retail. All of these impacts are one of the most important human activities in terms of environmental problems. And not every food has the same impact. As you can see in this graphic, meat products are at the top of the carbon footprint compared with other foods. And on top of that is beef. Beef is the meat that has the most environmental impacts of all the things that we can choose to eat. And on the bottom, we see plant-based foods like nuts and beans and peas. And I'm relating this to protein foods, because obviously we have other kinds of fruits and vegetables and things, but here we are comparing the protein-rich foods. So when we choose, we can choose from the top and have a high environmental impact, or we can choose from the bottom and have a low environmental footprint. Why this is a problem? Because meat consumption is increasing, and these impacts are growing as well. And this is a special case in countries with growing economies. And growing economies like Mexico or Argentina or Brazil that are on the top 10 beef consumers. World meat consumption per capita has risen a lot from the 60s, where we used to eat just 24 kilograms of meat. Now we are reaching 45 kilos of meat per capita. That's a lot of meat that needs to be produced. This is due to several factors, like the population growth, that our diets have changed and now are rich in protein. And this increase in income in all these countries that before used to have meat every now and then, but now with these economies, they can do it more often and probably even daily. Of all these protein-rich foods, beef is by far the more destructive to the environment. And you can see here that the environmental footprint in terms of greenhouse emissions is way higher than other meat types like chicken or pork. And the same for fresh water use, for annual land use, and for fertilizer production. So we want to reduce meat consumption, but especially we need to reduce beef because of these impacts on the environment. Several strategies have been proposed to reduce meat and especially beef consumption. From direct pricing strategies, like prices that incorporate the environmental cost, because many times the industries receive a lot of subsidies and we don't see the real cost of beef. So now beef and meat are cheaper, but that's not because they are really cheaper, but because they are subsidized. So the next strategy has been to have regulatory approaches, like an accountability and traceability. We want to know how much is spent and where the meat comes from, and to prohibit or eliminate tax policies and subsidies that support the expansion and the exports of meat. So we can produce very cheap meat in places like Brazil or Mexico that go to the north, and we do not have the environmental impact cost of that meat on those countries, but is diffused in the production countries. Another strategies have been the use of management practices. And this is like increase the efficiency in production, the improved technology, the change in animal diets to lower the impacts. However, this technology, there have been many research that has shown that the environment, the technology improvements are soon overpassed by the consumption. So we are in a never-ending run where we increase the efficiency and the technology, but then prices go down and we consume more. So the last point is to reduce demand, especially of beef. And this can be achieved through sustainable diets and behavior change. So we have seen now that beef is a conservation problem because it has a high environmental impact. It causes biodiversity loss, deforestation, soil degradation, habitat loss, water pollution and demand. And we need to reduce its consumption. There have been several studies made, mostly in the UK and the US, Canada, and other countries in Europe. but we have a very little knowledge of what's going on the global south in Latin American countries. And even though we have some knowledge of what is going on in the north, the countries in the south have very different food cultures. So we need to know the difference between countries, between men and women, between age groups, and there can be very different diets. There can be differences in the food environments and the type of food that is chosen in each country, the way people think about food, and the food election motives among the different groups. As we all know, for example, Argentina and Brazil are countries that have a very high meat culture. They have the asados, they grill meat in every party. So how can we ask them to reduce their meat consumption when it's something that is so important for their culture? How can we change that reduction? How can we change that culture to achieve a reduction in their consumption? So one of the options is to design behavioral change interventions that are based on the consumption motives of each population, of each specific population. But what are behavioral change interventions? Well, there are a set of coordinated activities designed to change specific behaviors, and intervention types can include things from education to persuasion, incentives, training, restriction, environmental restructuring, modeling, and enablement. And to design effective behavioral change interventions, we need to investigate specific factors that influence a behavior in populations. So we need to know why do we eat beef, and also why we become vegetarian, because we are going from one extreme to the other. So why do we eat beef? There are many motives to eat beef. It goes from taste. People eat what they like, and taste is one of the main motives to eat beef and meat. The habits, because in many countries, as I said, we are used to eat meat. We are used to eat beef. I remember when I was young, my mom wouldn't consider a meal complete if it didn't have meat. So that's how I grew up, and many people is like that in many of these countries. Another thing that we, another motive to eat meat is the quality. To eat meat is the quality of the meat, and this is also related, for example, with price. In Mexico, we can find very cheap meat, and we can find also very expensive meat, and it all depends on the quality. Because if we want cheap meat, the quality won't be very good. But if we want high quality meat, we will have to pay more for that. Meat is also considered as part of a healthy diet, and doctors will tell you that you need protein to build muscle and to have a functioning body. But protein can be also from plant origin, not just meat origin. And this is one of the points that is very complicated when we become vegetarians, for example. People also eat meat because it's natural. It's natural for us. We are omnivores. So we eat meat. So it's part of our nature. Another reason is the family, our age, income, education, lifestyle. Urban populations eat more meat than people in rural settings. And as I said before, there are cultures, traditions, and knowledge, and the availability. For example, in Mexico, the north of the country has a very strong beef tradition, but the south, they eat more pork. And in the center, we can find more lamb. So availability of different types of meat will also influence the type of dishes that we prepare. And finally, for why do we eat beef? Men tend to eat more meat and more beef than women. Women eat less beef and are more prone to be vegetarians. And vegetarians base their choices on ethics, on animal welfare, on the conserve of the environment, Also on health, and health here plays a double role, because for one part, we need the protein to be healthy, but also if we eat too much meat, we can have cardiovascular problems. Nutrition is a reason both to eat beef and meat and to become vegetarian, and all depends on what we want to achieve through our diet. Familiarity with dishes is another important thing. Cooking skills are incredibly important, because for many people, it's just very easy to throw a steak on the grill and you have a meal. And if you want to have a vegetarian meal, you need to have more time and more skills to prepare something that is tasty, and you need to have the knowledge to do a proper balanced meal. And many people find that as a barrier to become vegetarian. Behavior is difficult to change, and it requires diverse strategies to be applied simultaneously to change beef consumption or meat consumption. Throughout my study, I identified several strategies that can be applied at an institutional level. And when I talk about institutional, I don't mean only educational institutions. It has been seen that in many countries, institutions, not just educational, but restaurants at government level, or prisons can have a high food consumption. So when we modify the policies that are applied to the food that is served in these institutions, we can have a big impact. But in my case, for the university strategies that I identified were this. We need to work with chefs and cooks to improve the taste and the visual appeal of beef dishes. In places like Cambridge, you have a strong vegetarian tradition, and students ask for the vegetarian dishes. But in Mexico, you can go to a cafeteria and you will find one dish that is vegetarian, and the rest will have meat. Because in my study, I found that only 3% of the students that participated in my study were vegetarians. That's a very, it was just 60 students out of 1,800 students. So we do not have the market for those vegetarian dishes. So we need to convince the people that is eating meat that these beef-free dishes or meat-free dishes, vegetarian dishes, are attractive and that they would like to try them. So yesterday we were talking, Francesca and Ryan and me, about the importance of involve chefs and cooks on this process. Another strategy will be to increase the offer and availability of beef-free dishes, because if we can use other types of meat, we can reduce the environmental impact of those dishes. If we use chicken or pork, that could reduce by more than half the environmental impact of the dish if we compare it with a beef dish. We have to consider the price and convenience. Price, because probably we can produce vegetarian dishes and alternative meat dishes that are cheaper than the beef-free dishes, and that will be an incentive to for people to buy them. We also have to do some environmental structure changes at restaurants and cafeterias. And Emma Garnett has been working on that, on changing how we present the dishes on the food bar, so that vegetarian options are first, and then the less environmental desirable dishes are at the end. So for people that really, really want to eat beef, they will have to wait until the end of the line. But people that is not so prone to eat meat can have other options to choose from. We also need to increase the knowledge. Many people don't know how much protein they need. And that can be a problem, because most people will eat more protein than they require. What is recommended now is about 45 to 55 grams of protein per day for an adult. Women on the lower side and men on the higher side. And it's very easy to achieve that because we can eat other types of protein, not just meat, during breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So when you add up all these different foods, you can get your protein requirement in a more sustainable way. We need to increase knowledge also on the health benefits of vegetarian diets or plant-based diet. So I think you lost me, right?
Yes, I was about to say, I wasn't sure if it was me or, yes, we lost you for the last 20 seconds, maybe.
Okay. I'm trying to share my screen again. Can you see it now? Okay. And the last one is the gender-oriented interventions. So we need men especially to be more enthusiastic and to want to be part of these interventions. We need them to want to try new dishes and want to try different options. So we can have, for example, modeling, and we can have athletes or people that, men that are important in their community and that are vegetarian or that have reduced their meat consumption as a model for them to have a different type of diet and to have different choices. There are also strategies at individual level that we can all do. From the most obvious, that is eating meat or eating protein according to the environmental footprint, so we can have more pulses to get our protein requirement for the day. And then we can choose eggs, chicken, pork, and leave beef just for special occasions if we really, really, really like it. Many people that I know is like, I cannot stop eating beef, it's so good. But good, what kind of, or what type of beef is that good? Probably a cut, a ribeye or a steak that is really nice, but you don't eat that every day. So we can choose other options for our daily meals and just leave that special type of meat for a special occasion or for as a treat, but include other types of food protein for our daily meals. We need to include more pulses in our diet. Mexico was a country with a very strong bean tradition. Many dishes will have beans. But sometime along the way, beans were seen as something that only poor people ate. So we need to change that perception and put beans on their proper place in our diet. And Mexican cultural food tradition is very diverse, and we use beans and other pulses in very different dishes. So I think that could be very easy to achieve. I don't know in other countries how pulses are in terms of food culture, but it's something that we need to work. Another one is portion size. One thing that I have seen in Mexico, and probably you have seen it also in other places, is that we don't really know the portion size of meat. So when you go to a restaurant, probably they will serve you double what you need as a portion of meat. Not 60 grams, but 120 or 150. Or if it's a steak, even more than that. And people doesn't know how much is the proper size of a portion of meat. So knowledge will be important in terms of how much do I need to eat. So one thing that I just found recently is that in Mexico, the Eat Lancet Commission recommended that the portion size of red meat would be 60 grams, but that's per week, once a week. And we are eating around 170 grams of meat, of red meats daily. So that will be a huge change. Can we achieve that? It's very difficult to tell people, stop, you can only eat red meat once, and it has to be a very small size portion. So how can we transition from a big piece of meat to a small piece of meat just once a week? That will require a lot of work, and that will require substitution. We need to start changing from the high impact beef, from beef, to low impact meats like chicken, and help people go through that road in with time, not from one week to the other. Probably this will require years to be achieved, and we need to see how we can work with industry and government, because they want the opposite. They want people to eat more, not to eat less. So how can we do that transition when we have, for one side, the industry and the government trying to make people eat more, and for the other one, we have the environment that cannot sustain that consumption and production of meat, and we need to reduce it? I don't have the answer. I think we need to work together to find out ways to get to that equilibrium where we don't need too much, and the industry will say, okay, we can do that. I don't know if it will have to be through better meat quality so that they don't lose on money, and you can still eat meat. It will be more expensive, but you will eat less, and that will reduce production without interfering in the economic market. I don't know, we have to do a lot of work on that. Another thing is, as we need to change the portion size of meat, we need to start seeing the meat as part of the dish and not as the main ingredient of the dish. In Mexico, that will be easy to achieve because we use so many ingredients that we can start reducing the amount of beef and increasing the amount of pulses and vegetables and other ingredients, so that you can still taste the meat, but it's not the meat dish. It's a plant-based meat, a plant-based dish with some meat. And finally, we need to eat locally produced meat. Why this is important? We were talking yesterday. Mexico produces a lot of meat, but it's not for the national market. We kind of export half of the meat we produce, and then we import half of the meat that we need. So this meat increases the environmental impact because it has to travel long distances. We export meat to places as far as Japan or China. And then we import meat, for example, from the US. We sell half of our beef to the US, and then we import half of it as well, because we send the good meat and we import low quality meat that is cheaper for our market. So when we start eating what we produce locally, we can reduce also the environmental footprint of that food. And flexitarianism is an option also to achieve a sustainable diet. A flexitarian diet is mostly plant-based while allowing meat and other animal products in moderation. And I think if you want people that eat a lot of meat now to transition to a more plant-based diet, we need to be flexible, and flexitarian diets can be an option to guide them through that process and to achieve the transition from a high meat diet to a low meat diet, or even a plant-based diet or vegetarian diet. And that's about for me now. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Thank you. And I'm glad that we managed to hear you for the whole duration. I wanted to ask you very quickly then, you mentioned it. I mean, the time scale, what sort of time scale are we looking at? Because obviously, if we're thinking of changing the behavior, as you just said, cultural traditions are so ingrained that it would be really hard to convince people, families to move away from the consumption of meat, especially for celebrations, etc. So what would you, and I'd love to hear also from the people in the group, I mean, which one would be the factors that can accelerate this change? You know, what can we focus on? Ideally on policy, working with the business, and obviously then the consumers, but maybe I wonder if there is anything in particular that can be accelerated. And also the other thing, you say increase the knowledge. How can we increase that knowledge? Who should do that? Because of course, if it comes from a bunch of academics, often it's seen, you know, it depends. And again, who do they talk to? So this, you know, it's obviously quite a complex issue. And would, for example, ambassadors, you were talking also in Mexico, the gender, could, for example, famous male people send the message that actually eating meat is not as macho, you know, and in fact it's the opposite. Is there something like this kind of considered in the behavioral change studies?
Many questions.
Yes, sorry. You can just pick one, and then it'd be interesting to hear from the others.
I think it has to be a joint effort. I think we need to have talks with the industry and the governments. Policies need to change, because this wasn't our diet 50 or 60 years ago. Everything changed when meat became cheap and with markets that were pushing to produce more. And one of the problems was the US, that they have a surplus of grain, and they started using that to feed cattle, and then they had a surplus of meat. So markets are driving these trends, and we need to make changes on that. When we talk about the environmental cost that is not reflected on the prices, that's something that we need to address, because many countries like Brazil are paying the environmental cost of producing meat. And that is not reflected on the price of meat in other countries. When we can put the environmental cost of production on anything we consume, I think that can be a stop sign to say, this is too expensive. Can I keep buying as much as I am buying, or do I need to reduce my consumption and focus on quality instead of quantity? And I think that doesn't apply only to food, but to clothes and to anything that we are consuming. But we need to see those environmental costs reflected on the price. Otherwise, it's going to be cheap, and then it's going to be available for everyone. And here you may say, yes, but poor people need meat. This study that I was talking about, the Lancet adaptation for Mexico, they found that indigenous communities were the closest to the Eat Lancet Commission recommendations, that we don't need to tell them to stop eating meat because they are eating the right amounts, or even they can increase a bit. They're not the problem.
And I'm sure they're healthier as well.
Yeah, their diets are healthier. So we are not saying that poor people is going to suffer the consequences. In terms of food, they are eating the closest diet to what is recommended now. So we don't really want them to eat lots of meat, because that will have consequences that the rest of the population is suffering, like in cardiovascular disease and diabetes and other things. So I think it has to be a work for many institutions, for governments. We need to get the industry on board. And I have no idea how we can do that. There has been a lot of studies and talks about sustainable cattle ranching. And yes, we can do sustainable cattle ranching, but that won't produce the amount of beef that we are consuming. That will have to reduce the amount a lot.
And do you think, Patricia, that in terms of strategy, focusing on, say, health for certain categories would work better than focusing on environmental strategies? So almost like differentiating the strategy according to the class you're talking to.
I'm not sure, because health has been, as I said, used for eating meat and for being vegetarian. All depends on where you want to focus. But what I have seen is that the market puts things into like a fashion, no? So now it's in fashion to eat more quinoa, for example, no? Or they put on fashion almonds or almond milks. Or I think we need people to start seeing plant-based diets as a kind of fashion, as a kind of thing that we want to achieve, that people is doing all over. No, they are not just eating meat all over. We want them to eat other things as well. Yeah. I'm not sure if health is a good reason. Health was not a reason in my study. My study was specific for taste and habits. And to achieve taste, we need, however you call it, ambassadors. And chefs can be ambassadors.
Exactly, the chef network.
If they produce food that is so appealing, so visually appealing and taste appealing, that we don't need meat, because this is really tasty.
Yeah. But as you said, the market is crazy, because it's so much more expensive to buy a plant-based sausage, which we normally get for our barbecues, than a pork sausage. That's certainly wrong. But Ryan, please, you have a question. I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
No, it's really fascinating following the discussion too after, and especially after we talked yesterday to see your full presentation, Patricia. Thank you. I guess I wanted to pick up on a bit of part of your presentation within this discussion of sort of like, why are some things more expensive than others? And I sort of have two broad areas for a question. One, I guess, is like the role of the state, because I know you're focusing mainly on sort of changing habits and that more like consumption-based social psychology. But I am curious, like, okay, so if the state is involved, would they be able to implement some sort of true cost accounting of the environmental costs? And that's sort of one. And the second would be more about the sort of like food miles question, or sustainable beef, something like that. So having consumers go to the store and maybe having the state subsidize sustainable beef or beef that's local, or other types of meat, again, that have like a sort of higher carbon footprint. So you could sort of have a two-pronged approach, right? Where increasing or including the environmental costs of beef would rise the price, of course, especially that's more harmful to the environment. And at the same time, subsidizing more sustainable animal protein or even plant-based protein could potentially help bring, you know, those costs more competitively for the consumers? Sorry, that's a lot. I meant that just two simple questions, and I think they still kind of are, but I kind of talk myself in circles.
No, I like that idea. Why? What will happen if governments will start subsidizing sustainable options instead of the non-sustainable options? That will be great. And I think that will be the way to go. Because why do you want to subsidize an industry that is destroying the planet? It will cost you a lot later. So if you start subsidizing the good guys, the ones that are doing the proper work, that they are doing the sustainable production, I think it will be great. I think that's a good idea.
Because it's true. I mean, from the market point of view, I mean, I know this is probably very simplistic, and it'd be great to have an economist here with us, but you could probably argue that if you have that shift from meat to, say, post-production, you're still going to make some money and still on the market selling whatever products you're selling. So in a way, you think, okay, I'm no longer selling shoes, now I'm selling hats, you know, sort of it's kind of a silly comparison, but you're still going to sell and make money. So in a way, I think, again, I think I'm missing the economics here, but, you know, we need to sort of connect also with trade specialists. Brian, I see you have a hand. Maybe you have the answer to this question.
We cannot hear you.
Okay. No, thank you for a very interesting talk. I think your point about transition is the critical one, really, because the problem we seem to have is that we're on a trajectory that tends to portray animal source foods as harmful and plant source foods as beneficial. And so it's a binary situation, which of course is always very unhelpful. And I had an email from a colleague of mine in Nairobi who sends weekly digests of the literature. And very helpfully, she drew my attention to this paper, in which it says that the future discourse will benefit from a renewed focus on such healthy foundations as nourishment and commensality. I want to just pick up on this idea of commensality, which I was unfamiliar with, but it's interesting to see the literature that's being quoted in this respect. It's this idea of eating together, the act of eating together, which is now being studied in a range of disciplines. And when you think of the amount of time that is spent on projecting television programs about food in the UK, at any rate, it is unbelievable. There are so many programs. And it seems to me that there are two things that we probably ought to be emphasizing much more strongly, and also from what you say. First of all, that it isn't a binary choice. We have to have some time scale. The policymakers do need to map out a proper time scale for the transition, so that we get away from this idea that it's either one or the other, as you were saying. But this idea of the importance of eating together, and there's a unique opportunity for television programmers to producers to pick up this idea at the moment as we're coming out of COVID, where everybody's tended to be isolated, but now there's a much greater opportunity for people coming together and actually seeing what each other, what we're eating. And perhaps this idea, there's a paper here, which is what is commensality, a critical discussion of an expanding research field. I wonder if you feel that might be something that should be looked at more closely.
I think so. I think that will be great because, as I was mentioning, cooking skills can be a barrier. So when you have commensality, it's not just the act of eating together and to share a meal, but also to cook it together and then to pass the knowledge between generations, because that's something that has been lost. Before, it was not just the meal time, it was the cooking time. and you will cook with your grandmother and your mother, and all the family will be involved. But with the actual style of lifestyle is very difficult, because everyone is working, and then they don't even eat a meal together, and they eat whatever is available. And I think we need to go back to that. I love the idea of commensality. I haven't thought about that, but it's really, I think it will be a very important part of transition.
Yeah.
Patricia, do they teach children in schools? Do they teach them how to cook? Is there a
No.
subject? Because that's something that we are working on, to introduce that into the curriculum.
I think it will be very important, because that's the way to teach them not just cooking skills, but nutrition and health.
Yes, exactly.
And if you cannot cook yourself a proper meal, then you end up eating all that kind of food that the industry is selling, fast food and junk food and things that are bad for the environment and are bad for you. One of the things that I would like to do at my university is precisely cooking courses for students, but also workshops for chefs and cooks, so that they can get together and get new recipes and new ideas on how to prepare those the food that they are serving. And in Mexico, we have a really great food tradition. We have so many ingredients, so many different types of food that we can use, and not just the same. I don't know how many types of food we're eating right now, but it's like 150 different things that we eat out of thousands. So we need to make our diet more diverse as well, and that will help because the industry is focusing on just a few ingredients, and we don't want that for our planet. We want diversity of animals, of plants, of everything.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone have any more questions? I'm conscious about the time. I'm afraid I had to leave at 3, but anyone has other questions or comments? I know that there's also Emma. It'd be great to hear from Emma if she's still here.
I'm still here.
You're still there? Great. Excellent, Emma.
Hi, Patricia. Great to see you again, and thanks for talking. I put a comment in the chat. Really interesting finding that you said that indigenous communities in Mexico were closest to the Eat Lancet diet. I just had a Google and couldn't find the link. I was wondering if you could share that finding.
Yeah, I can share the paper with you. It was very interesting because they adapted the Eat Lancet Commission report, the recommendations to Mexico, and the first thing they did was to reduce the amount of calories, because that report is for 2,500 calories, and for Mexico they downed it to 2,000 calories because we are not as active as we should. So that's part of the reason that the portion size got smaller, because we are sedentary. But I can share it with you later.
Thank you.
I will send you the paper.
Thank you for this. Yes, that I can share with the group, and likewise the paper that Brian has just shared with us. But it's funny that you mentioned the indigenous people, because with the older our older child, they were doing Victorian times, so we were looking at the Victorian sort of dishes and food, and I read several papers that they were eating at the time healthier than what we're eating now. So that's quite funny to read. Theo.
I can end perhaps with something slightly frivolous, but I wanted to talk a while ago where somebody said the best way to get people to change their diet, or the cheapest way, would be to pay Kim Kardashian to be vegetarian. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, in a way, because people do look to influences and what they see as status in society, because unfortunately, a lot of people see eating a lot of meat and so-called, modern diets as being a sign of their modernity and their progress. And so they're not going to be inspired by the fact that indigenous people eat the Lancet diet. They're going to sort of feel, they're eating that diet because they don't have access to my wonderful modern diet. And so we have to think about the kind of motivations that make people eat what they eat today. And they do get influenced by what their peers and role models and others do. And we all think the government should be doing more, and we all know they're not going to do more because they're not wanting to make themselves unpopular. And it's a major imposition into individual choice and freedoms for the government to, they would feel, come along and start telling people what they should be eating. So I just am not banking on government suddenly coming up with this incredible package of policies that's going to interfere with what people eat. So we're going to have to look elsewhere. And I do think looking at what influences people's mindset, psychology, as you said, through TV, education, that type of thing is probably where we're going to have to go.
Grace, you have a comment or a question?
Yes, I have a question. Hello. Yeah, I'm Grace. I'm a first-year PhD student from University of East Anglia, and my topic is shifting diets towards plant-based for environmental sustainability. And I'm planning to do the study in the UK and in China as well. I think China is facing similar issues because it's quite ingrained in the culture, people eating meat, and also because of the population and the growth of income and the meat consumption is increasing. So I saw the slides of what you suggest for the institutional level and the strategies for the individual level. I think they are great. I'm just wondering, have you implemented any of those in your studies in Mexico? Those strategies?
Sadly, not yet, because the pandemic hit, and then the university closed its doors and all the restaurants closed down, and we haven't been able to have the students back and the university life back. So we are hoping that by the end of the year we'll have normal life again, and we will have students come back to the campus and restaurants opening again, and then we can start doing some studies, because right now everyone is at home and eating with families or alone, and it's kind of difficult to implement these things when you're in the middle of a pandemic. But hopefully soon we can do that.
Yes, I think they I believe some of them would work great. Thank you.
And the thing is that we need several strategies applied at the same time, because one is very difficult to achieve success because there are so many things that need to change at the same time. So that's why we would like to do a very integral work and try to make the university apply some policies for the food vendors and for the university restaurants. Let's see if we can do that. But the plan is to do a very comprehensive strategy intervention with many strategies.
Yeah, multi-component. I recently read a model called COM-V. So behavior is influenced by motivation, capability, and opportunity. Yes, and it would be good to have a multi-component intervention, have all those three, because they could interact with each other and influence the other one, and also the behavior would have an impact on those a variety of variables. Okay, thank you.
And Patricia, I mentioned yesterday my colleague Lily Jar at the Institute for Manufacturing. So she talks about the positive emotional benefit or the warm glow from active green. So, I wonder in a way if there is the knowledge associated with eating less meat and more plant-based diet, that if you know that you're contributing positively to the environment, perhaps that can also be a psychological factor that can be used. I can share her study on this warm glow.
Yeah, I don't know if in countries like Mexico, we are that far into an environmental culture. I'm sure that in Cambridge, you can measure that. And I mean, not many universities have banned beef from their campuses. And it's complicated for countries like Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, where beef is such an important part of food culture. I don't know. I think we need to go that way, to transition into people worrying about the environment. But right now, here, I don't see that. I mean, just 3% of my population is vegetarian. That's amazing. I mean, so it's just a few people worrying about animal welfare or about ethics or environment and stop eating meat because of that. So I'm not sure. I think we need to do research on that subject in countries with growing economies.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it will be really interesting, actually, as we were saying. I'm afraid that we got to through 3 o'clock and the end of our seminar, which has been really interesting. And unless there are other questions or burning comments before we close. No. Okay. Thank you so much, Patricia, for joining us today. And I will share your paper. I mean, the paper that you referred to. Yes, and the one that Brian also mentioned in the chat, as well as what Emma was referring to. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next Friday. And yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thanks, Patricia.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Emma.